It's a work of fiction that was written just for fun. What are you watching from? Let me know in the comments before we start our research. How far these things can go is always interesting to see. I've learned that houses hold memories in ways we don't always understand, as I've spent years looking into strange cases. The floors can hear footsteps. The walls pick up sounds. And sometimes, when a family line stops quickly, the structure itself seems to wait, remember, and keep secrets that the living have worked very hard to hide. The case I'm about to talk about stuck with me long after I closed the file. A land surveyor in a remote part of Newton County, Arkansas, asked a simple question that set the whole thing off in 1958. He was paid to look at a piece of land to see if it could be used to cut down trees. The house had been empty for decades, and the county records were only partly full. But when he got close to the building in the middle of the overgrown acreage, he saw something that made him stop everything he was doing and drive 3 hours to the closest campus library. Let me take you back in time to show you what he found, and more importantly, what it showed about a family that had been lost to history in the spring of 1914. Newton County is in the middle of the Ozark Mountains, which are made up of limestone bluffs, thick hardwood forests, and hollows that are so deep that sunlight has a hard time getting to the forest floor. This was a very remote country in the early 1900s. Getting close. Nearby Harrison, more than 20 miles away, was the train. There were many small towns spread out, linked by wagon roads that were impassable when it rained. Families who moved here did so to get away from the rest of the world. Some were running away from bills, others from scandal, and I think some were running away from something much more personal. Around 1889, the Murthen family moved to Newton County. There are annoying gaps in the records, which is why I say sometime what I know comes from putting together land deeds, scattered mentions in local newspapers, and a journal that turned up decades later for reasons I'll explain in a moment. Absalom Murthen was the leader. He was in his late 40s when he bought 340 acres of highly wooded land near the Buffalo River's mouth. He was from somewhere in the eastern part of the state, maybe Pointed County, but I couldn't find any birth or marriage records to back this up. His wife's name was Cordelia, and everyone said she was, almost never seen outside the landlines. The couple didn't have any live relatives in the area. What was unique about the Murths wasn't that they lived alone. A lot of families in the Ozarks stayed together. It was how the place they built was made. People who lived at the time said it looked like the house grew out of the mountain. Absalom built it using local rock for the base and lower walls. The upper stories were made of wood and went back into a natural cave formation. Parts of the building were. There were rooms that were dug into the rock face below. Visitors said that the temperature inside stayed the same no matter what time of year it was, that sounds echoed in strange ways, and that some rooms didn't have any natural light at all. Why would someone build a place like that? When I first heard about this case, that question kept coming back to me. In reality, it would be for insulation and safety from the cold winters and hot summers. But the more I looked, the more I thought the Murthens were building something bad, to keep lies from getting out. For almost 25 years, the family lived in peace. They did not go to the small Baptist church in Boxley, which is close by. In addition, they didn't take part in neighborhood events or harvest festivals. Absalom would go to Harrison twice a year to buy goods. He always paid in cash and never stayed for a long time to talk. Cordelia wasn't seen very often, so some people in the area thought she had died, but no death was ever reported. I only found one mention of Absalom in the October Boone County Headlight. 1897. A traveler going through said they heard singing coming from the Murthen property late at night. This was mentioned briefly in a column about strange events. One visitor said it sounded like a woman's voice singing the same tune over and over again for hours. When he went over to look into it, the singing stopped all of a sudden, and even though it was well past midnight, he didn't see any lights or signs of people being there. The writer just looked into it out of interest. What I thought about when I read that paragraph, though, changed. This case. To quickly tell you, this story is being shown on the Fear Behind You channel. For those of you who hear this on a different channel, please know that this movie has been copied and shared without my permission. If that's the case, please report it. Thanks for supporting unique material. It's one thing to act alone. Rigid, repeated action is a completely different thing. In February 1914, things began to change. Otis Arburn, a buyer of wood, went to Newton County to try to make a deal. Forest-cutting rights with several landowners. He knew that the Merthen property had valuable stands of old oak and walnut trees. People in the area told Raburn's family that they did not want tourists, but he was determined. His letters, which are kept in the records of the lumber company that bought his business in the 1940s, give the best account of what he saw. On a cold Tuesday morning, Rayburn got to the Merthen farm. In his letters, he said that the method was unsettling. The wagon. The trail became so narrow that it was almost impossible to walk on. Tree branches met above to make a cave that kept most of the winter sunlight out. He noticed that there was no smoke coming from the chimney when he came out into the open where the house had been. It was freezing outside. The building itself scared him. He wrote that it looked like it was hunched against the hillside, and that the top windows were dark and covered with something that made it impossible for him to see inside. At first, he thought the front door was slightly ajar because it stood a sign that someone was home and ready for guests. He called out more than once. There was no answer. Rayburn decided to go up to the door after waiting for almost an hour and getting cooler and more angry. The things he found inside would lead to a probe by the county, but the full report has never been found. I had to put together what happened based on Rayburn's private letters, a single newspaper story from a few weeks later, and the journal I mentioned earlier. The inside of the house was spotless. That's the first thing Rayburn noticed. Even though it looked like no one was there was no dust on the furniture and no spiders hanging from the ceiling. The hearth had cold ashes on it, but they looked new, like a fire had been there in the last day or two. There was a clean but empty pot hanging over the stove. The main room's table was set up for 2 people, with plates, cups, and other items that looked like they were ready for a meal. But there was nothing to eat or drink in. The larder, there was no sign of recent living beyond the way the household things were carefully arranged. Rayburn kept looking into things because he was both interested and feeling uneasy. He found a narrow set of stairs that led to the upper floor and another set of stone steps that led down into the cave part of the building. He picked to be the first one up. The rooms on the second floor were bedrooms, and both of them were empty. Care was taken when making the beds. The covers were tight, the pillows flattened out. A wooden closet held clothes for men and clothes for women, all of which Rayburn knew were at least 10 years out of style. He found a single sheet of paper on a small desk next to a window. It was written in a shaky hand and said only, "We kept our promise. The house will remember." Rayburn put the piece of paper in his pocket. It turned out to be an important piece of evidence, but it wasn't clear what kind of evidence it was. After that, he went down to the lower floor. The stone steps were smooth from being used for decades, and the temperature dropped a lot as he went deeper. As the passage opened up, it led to a number of rooms that had been shaped by people and by the natural erosion of limestone. Rayburn's lantern made shadows that moved on the walls, and he said he felt watched even though he didn't see anyone. In the largest chamber, he found out what made him leave the land right away and ride through the night to Harrison to call the police. I need to take a moment to recognize that what Rayburn said, to have seen, has never been checked by a third party. After the investigation, the house was found to be empty. What was in the lower rooms was taken away. Some people have said that Robburn made up or exaggerated his story, but his letters were private and were never meant to be shared, and the fear in his handwriting suggests that what he wrote was real. Robburn said that he found a circle of stones in the middle of the room. Each stone had writing on it that he didn't understand. Inside the circle, the ground had been dug up to a depth of about 3 feet. When he found the hole, it was empty, but the walls had deep scratches on them that looked like something had been trying to get out. Around the pit, there were personal things set up in a careful pattern. A hairbrush for women that still has gray hair stuck in the bristles. The time on a man's pocket watch stopped at midnight. 2 worn-out shoes stacked next to each other. A wedding band that fits a woman's hand and a lot of small bands. Rayburn did not open the cloth that the food was wrapped in. In his writing, he said the smell was of old earth and metal, like the ground was bleeding. He didn't look into it any further. He ran away. Police in Newton County, led by Prosper Gable, set up a search party that arrived at the Murthlen farm 3 days later. Most of the proof in the house had been taken away by that time. The room that Rayburn talked about was empty, except for the circle of stones. The upper rooms didn't have any private things in them. The only thing left was the paper Rayburn had taken. There was physical proof that the Murthens had been there. I found pieces of Sheriff Gable's report in the state archives. It said that the land showed signs of recent occupation, but no signs of violence or struggle. He said that the Murthens were missing and suggested that the case stay open until more information came in. That didn't happen at all. After that, the house sat empty for many years. People in the area avoided it with a determination that suggests they knew more than they admitted, were willing to make it public. The county finally took the property back because the taxes were not paid, but no one ever came forward to buy it. It just sat there, slowly being taken over by the trees. The wagon road was getting too narrow to use, and the clearing was getting smaller as young trees grew in and blocked the way of people living. That brings us back to 1958. The property assessor I talked about at the beginning was named Vernon Jessup, and he worked for a little rock company that figured out how much wood was worth for possible activities of harvesting. He was 43 years old, had a lot of life experience, and didn't seem to have many crazy ideas. The task he was given was simple. Look at the trees, guess how many board feet of sellable wood they have, and write a report for people who might want to buy the wood. Before going up to the house, Jessup spent 2 days looking at the outside of the land. From the time he saw the building through the trees, he didn't want to go near it. He later told his co-workers. He couldn't put his finger on why the building was in such bad shape by that point. Parts of the upper stories were falling down, and the limestone walls were stained from years of being outside. It should have looked like it was just left behind. It's sad, but not more than that. What Jessup found inside changed the course of his life. He got in through a hole in the front door that had been eaten away. When Rayburn visited 44 years ago, the inside had changed a lot for the worse. Some parts of the floor had given way, and the animals and water had ruined the furniture. But Jessup found a metal box in the corner of the main room, hidden by things that had dropped. Jessup used his surveying tools to open the closed box. The lock had become so rusted that it was impossible to lock. 3 things were inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them in great shape. A handwritten book with about 150 pages, a gerotype picture of a man and woman standing in front of what looked like the Murthen house soon after it was built, and construction, and a letter that was sealed and sent to no one. Everyone took all 3 things. He finished his survey report, which said that cutting down trees shouldn't be done because of the rough landscape and transportation problems. He would never forget what he found, though. Cordelia Murthan wrote the book. It goes from when they first came to Newton County in 1889 to an entry made on January 28, 1914, about 2 weeks before Ray Burns' visit. In 1962, I was able to read this magazine, thanks to a connection at the Jessup gave it to the Special Collections Library at the University of Arkansas. It's upsetting, not because of the graphic images, but because of what they show about the mental health of the people involved. Cordelia writes a lot about what she calls the covenant. She never fully explains where it came from or what it is, but it's clear that she and Absalom both thought they had made some kind of deal, a deal that called for certain actions and rituals and certain sacrifices. The word sacrifice is used a lot in this book, but it's always used in a general way. Cordelia writes about giving up ease, staying in touch with the outside world, and their future. She never says what specific things these sacrifices meant. The house is what she talks about. She writes about it in a way that is so personal that it almost creeps me out. She talks about having chats with the walls, negotiating with the stone foundations, and making offerings in the lower rooms. She talks about the house as if it were a live thing that has wants, moods, and expectations. The 3rd of February, 1902. Last night, the house was shaky. Absalom and I could tell because of the way the air moved through the holes. Like the doctor said, we burned the plants and it seemed to calm down. But for how long? Saturday, September 17th, 1908. We've kept our promise for 13 years. There are small ways that the house shows its thanks. The spring has clear water. There is still a lot of game. Things-wise, we don't lack anything. But sometimes I wonder what we have given in return. The 1st of December, 1913. The abscess is now weaker. It's felt in the house. I can see how the shadows get closer to him while he sleeps. It's patient, but you can only be so patient. We need to decide quickly what to do next. The most troubling pieces are the last few. In them, Cordelia talks about a choice she and Absalom have made together. They chose to end the vow in a way that would make sure the house always remembered them. She doesn't say what this means. The diary ends on January 1st, 28th, 1914, in the middle of a speech, as if she had been cut off. The person who found the letter has never opened it. It is still sealed up in the university's collection, and all requests to look inside have been turned down because of worries about preservation. I've often thought about what words are inside: a confession, a reason, and a warning. I think the two people in the picture are Absalom and Cordelia Murthan. They stand stiffly in front of the house with serious looks on their faces and nod at the camera at something just outside the frame. The granite walls behind them looked like they were ready to claim them. I have to say that I stared at their faces for an hour straight the first time I saw this picture. There is no fear or reluctance to be seen. Instead, there is a total resignation that makes it seem like the people were already okay with their fate. Where did the Murthans go? I'm sorry, but I don't know. No one ever found their bodies. There were never any death papers made. They just stopped being known as people sometime in early 1914, leaving behind only their strange house and the items Jessup found. But I can tell you about the ideas that have come up over the years, and you can decide for yourself what they mean. Some people thought the Murthans ran away and left their land to avoid debts or legal problems. They thought they were able to blend into American society in the early 1900s. This answer is easy to understand, but it doesn't explain the personal items that were left behind. Behind, the diary and the careful arrangements that Rayburn saw. Others thought there was foul play, possibly by neighbors who didn't like how private the family was or wanted their land. But there were no suspects or witnesses, and the land hadn't been claimed in years, which suggests that no one really wanted to buy it. The most disturbing idea came from a person in Newton County who was an amateur historian and spent the 1950s talking to old people to get their stories. More than a few of them, speaking on condition, stated that their parents had told them that the Murthans were doing something old that they had brought with them from wherever they came from. These sources talked about it in different ways. Some people called it folk magic. Others just said that the family had to keep the promises they made. In 1957, I talked to an old woman who said something that stuck with me. She said that her grandma had told her not to go near that property because it had grown a taste for bad things, not because of the mice. To show loyalty. She said that once you gave it something, it always wanted more. For a moment, I want to talk about the house again because knowing what happened to it helps me understand why this case has been so hard to solve for so long. 5 years after Jessup found it, in 1963, the county finally tore down what was left of the building. The timber company that hired Jessup in the first place chose to only do some harvesting because the ruins were a liability. A group was sent to take it down. The caves left over walls and fill them in. Clement Boggs, who was in charge of the group, kept a short record of the work. His notes, which are kept in the records of the County Historical Society, talked about how hard the job was. The walls of limestone were much stronger than thought. The cave rooms were deeper than any survey had shown, and the workers said they always felt uneasy. Some said it was because they were so far away, while others wouldn't talk about it at all. It was the third day of destruction when some of the workers found a small carved figure tucked away in a crack in the foundation. The figure was a human shape in a position of prayer. It was made of a dark material, probably petrified wood. The worker put it away as a curiosity. Boggs's notes show that worker quit without giving a reason the next morning. He left his tools, his last paycheck, and a short note that said, "Put it back." Boggs found the figure among the man's things that he had left behind and threw it into the demolition waste. By the end of the week, the destruction was done. The cave rooms were sealed with rocks and concrete. The land was cleared and pine seedlings were planted so that it could be used for lumber in the future. Not long after that, there was nothing left to show that there had ever been a house there. But this case bothers me in this way. What has had me upset for decades. Even though the house is gone, the land has never been developed properly. It didn't work out for the pine plantation. Several later owners have given up on their plans after what they called an oppressive atmosphere. In the 1980s, one developer said that his measuring equipment always broke down on that one piece of land, but it worked perfectly on land next to it. The sounds are another thing. When hikers camped near the old Myrth property in 1997, they said they heard music in the middle of the night. They said there was one female voice singing the same tune over and over for hours. They looked into it and found nothing. A music teacher from Fayetteville, one of the hikers, said that the tune didn't sound like any folk song or hymn she knew. She said it made her feel sad and hopeful at the same time, like she was waiting for an answer. A few years ago, I found that singing teacher. Even though she was old, she still remembered that night very clearly. Many times, she said, she had tried to write down the music she heard, but it always seemed to change when she did. She said it was written down because it didn't want to be remembered that way. It was eager to be felt. I asked her what she thought about what she had heard. She didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she said, "Some places hold on to things, people, memories, and promises. That place felt like it was still holding on, still waiting for something that was owed." The Murthan case was never officially closed. It is still listed as an unsolved missing persons investigation in Newton County, even though no one has been charged. The journal has been in its archival box at the university for over 50 years, but no one has asked to see it. The photograph hangs in a forgotten corner of a regional history exhibit, and the sealed letter has not been opened. And somewhere in the Ozark Hills, under the pines that never grew quite right, the foundations of that strange house are still there, buried and sealed, but maybe not completely quiet. I have asked myself many times what the Myrthans were really doing in those decades of isolation, There are hints in the journal, but no clear answers. Cordelia wrote as if some things were too obvious to need explaining, as if anyone reading would already understand what covenants are and how they create obligations. Maybe she thought that was true for the person she imagined reading her words. Maybe she was writing for herself, or maybe she was writing for the house, keeping track of their faithfulness for a group that couldn't read but could understand. When I first went to Newton County in 1964 to do my research, I talked to an old man at a general store in Jasper who told me something I will never forget. He said that his father had met Absalom Myrthan once, soon after the family arrived in the 1890s. His father said that Absalom seemed hollowed out, like the human parts of him had already been traded for something else. I asked the old man what his father thought Absalom had received. Some people are so focused on the deal that they forget to ask what they're really getting. The note in Rayburn's pocket said, "The house remembered." We kept our promise, and the house will remember. I think about those words a lot. I think about what it means for a place to remember, for walls, foundations, and buried stones to hold something that should have been spread out with the people. There are solutions to some cases. You collect evidence, talk to witnesses, make a timeline, and eventually the truth comes out. The guilty are found, and the innocent are found to be innocent. I think about Cordelia's journal entries, her conversations with the structure that protected her, and her offerings in the chambers below. And I think about that melody that the hikers heard in 1997. It's still being sung, still waiting, and still expecting something in return for decades of patient devotion. In some stories, the ending makes sense, but not in this case. What I can tell you is that Absalom and Cordelia Myrthan lived on that remote property for about 25 years, where they built something strange that was partially underground and carefully recorded their rituals and beliefs. They disappeared without a trace in early 1914, and for decades afterward, people who visited that place reported strange events they couldn't explain. The bloodline ended. The Myrthans didn't have any heirs or relatives who came forward to claim the property or look into their disappearance. Whatever legacy they wanted to leave died with them. But the house, or what's left of it buried beneath those struggling pines, may remember differently. On my last trip to Newton County in 1968, I hired a local guide to take me to the exact spot where the Myrthan house had stood. The demolition site was partly overgrown, but you could still see the depression in the ground where the house had been. The cave chambers were full, and the pine seedlings that had been planted 5 years earlier were sickly, with yellowing needles even though they had good soil and rain. I stood there for about an hour as the afternoon light faded. I'm not a superstitious person. My career is based on facts, evidence, and logic. But I will say that standing there, I felt something I have never been able to put into words. It wasn't fear, it was more like recognition, as if something under my feet. A young man who had grown up in the area was my guide. He stood at the edge of the clearing and wouldn't move closer. When I asked him why, he said that his grandmother had told him stories about this place that made it clear that some debts cannot be settled. That was a promise that went beyond the person who made it. I asked him what he meant. He looked at me with a look I can still remember. "You're the researcher," he said. "Figure it out. The Myrthan case is in my files, along with photos, transcribed journal entries, interview notes, and unanswered questions. Every few years, I pull it out and go over what I know." I look at the picture of Absalom and Cordelia standing in front of their strange creation. I read Cordelia's words about the restless house and the coming deadline, and I wonder what they thought would happen if they kept their stories secret. They told the house what they wanted it to do with their love, whether they expected something in return, or whether keeping the promise was enough. The Ozarks are full of abandoned places, homesteads that didn't work out, communities that died out, and dreams that turned into the hard reality of subsistence farming and being alone. Most of these places are forgotten, and their histories are lost to time and indifference. But I think some places refuse to be forgotten. Some places just wait. If you're hiking in Newton County near the Buffalo River, you might come within a few miles of where the Murthan house used to be and not even know it. There are no markers, signs, or other evidence that anything important ever happened there. But if you're there at night and the wind is still, you might hear something. It could be a melody or a single voice singing the same song it has been singing for a long time. I can't tell you what it means, or if the Murthans found what they were looking for, or lost everything in the process. I can only tell you what I learned from my research, and what questions I still have. The Bloodline ended in 1914. 2 people disappeared from a world that barely knew they existed. They left behind their strange house, their journal, a photograph, and a sealed letter. And somewhere in the Ozark Hills, something still remembers, something still waits, something still. That's the end of the paperwork. I can't figure out what happens next, but please let me know in the comments if you know more, have heard stories, or found evidence I missed. This case has been bothering me for a long time. Maybe together we can figure out what the Murthans were really doing in those hills and what they left behind when they disappeared.